dead school. This story happened to me when I was just 16. My friend Oscar and I were quite brave guys. We were from Detroit, and, as you know, there are many abandoned buildings and structures in this city. Oscar and I loved adventures in these abandoned buildings. It was our shared passion. Adrenaline, insane adrenaline. One fine day, we heard a story about an abandoned school not far from our neighborhood. Rumors said that at night, its doors open and all sorts of wicked things happen inside. Many passers-by reported seeing various silhouettes resembling people. When Oscar and I were told about this school, we both shook our heads, smiling. Oh, come on, what nonsense. But we caught each other's eye, deciding to go there and check it out for ourselves. The next day, I told my parents that I was going to sleep over at Oscar's. And Oscar told his parents he was sleeping over at mine. So our parents had no clue that we were sneaking around somewhere at night. We arrived at the school late in the night, and guess what? The doors were indeed open. Probably homeless people. We smiled and decided to go in. But as soon as we crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut with such a bang that we both jumped in surprise. We tried to open it back, but it wouldn't budge. Guess we're playing by their rules, or it's just a draft, said Oscar. We both laughed out loud. At first, it was quiet inside the school. We decided to check out the classrooms. The first two were empty, but in the third, we nearly messed ourselves. We saw blood on the walls and children lying against them, but when we blinked, they disappeared. Then the door slammed shut. I heard a squeak and turned around. A piece of chalk, as if by itself, was writing on the board. "Get out of this place!" Then there was a piercing scream from the second floor. Oscar, panicking, ran towards the window, but something like an invisible hand threw him back, and he hit the wall. I froze on the spot, unable to move, fear piercing my body. I saw the silhouette of a dead teacher who was looking at me and gesturing with her finger. No! She started moving toward me. In horror, I ran to Oscar, who was still conscious. I helped him up and said, "We need to get out of here urgently." We kicked down the door and ran into the corridor where we were met by dead teachers and students. They were looking at us angrily, but we just ran, closing our eyes. And then I was knocked out. When I came to, we were lying on the sidewalk near the school. Oscar also regained consciousness. We got up and ran away from there. We didn't tell anyone. I was afraid that they would consider us insane. After that moment, we stopped exploring abandoned buildings. Exactly a year after we went to that school, Oscar died. He was hit by a car. I was shocked. On the day of his funeral, I returned home and saw a chalk inscription on the wall. "You're next."
Girl rat.
The story from a girl named Hella. I'm Hella, the girl they called a rat. My family moved to London after my father lost his job, but the new home and school weren't as I had dreamed. From the first day in my new class, I realized I wouldn't find friends here. My classmates turned away, didn't include me in their games, didn't want to talk to me. I thought the situation would change over time, but it only got worse. They began to mock me. They called me a rat, beat me, stole my lunches, and ruined my textbooks. They even deliberately threw me into a river once. On one such day, all alone, I decided to take revenge. On the way home, I found a dead rat, ground it in a meat grinder, and fried it. The stench was horrible. I put the resulting patty into my lunch container and brought it to school. My classmates, as usual, took my lunch and started eating it, and I smiled, seeing them getting sick, but they didn't let it go unnoticed. Under the pretext of reconciliation, they lured me into the basement and locked me there. Desperate, I looked for a way out and found a crack in the wall. Looking into it, I saw the school principal, and then a few more cracks that revealed views of other school staff. One of them was wide enough to crawl through, but I got stuck. There was no phone connection, so I spent several days there. I lost a lot of weight and managed to crawl through another crack that led me straight to the classroom. There were many rats around me. They flocked to me because of my smell. They didn't bother me. Seeing my tormentors, I crawled through another crack in the wall with the rats behind me and lunged at them to scare them to death. I succeeded. But then the irreversible happened. The rats attacked the children and the teacher, biting them, chunks of flesh torn off by the hungry rodents.
It was horrific. When everything calmed down, I was left alone in the class, in the center of the room, surrounded by bloodied rats.
Crazy bracelet.
My name is Harry, and I'm already 60 years old. I live in an old house not far from the former village where I studied and grew up. This village and its abandoned school are places of my terrifying memory. Every time I drive past the school, I get goosebumps all over my body. We are forever striving to forget our past, especially when it's unpleasant. But here's my story. I was that student who was always labeled with the bracelet brainless. Everyone told me, "Harry, you need to study better." But sometimes I had the impression that they gave them to me for no reason, because I was not from a well-off family. This bracelet became a part of me. My friend was Charlie. He received even more bracelets, and at some point his arms were covered with them like musketeer cuffs. We were unhappily united in that school. Then one day an incident happened. Charlie got caught on a window that he was opening for ventilation with his bracelets. He got so caught that his body was pulled into the window. He fell from the 3rd floor and landed head first, breaking his neck. Charlie died on the spot. He was no longer with us. That changed everything. The school was closed, and people began to leave the village because there was only one school. But the story did not end there. Passing by the school, we noticed strange things. Lights are on in the windows. Sometimes they turn on, sometimes they go out. Sometimes strange sounds are heard. Children's voices, whispers, screams. It seems that either homeless people live there, or some evil entity resides. I decided to find out what was happening there. Armed with a flashlight, I went there one night. The old building looked creepy, but I went in. Inside it was dark and empty. Only old posters reminded of past days. I felt a cold wind and heard a whisper. I turned around and saw him. It was Charlie. His ghostly figure was covered with bracelets, and he looked at me with empty eyes. He silently raised his hand and showed me one of the bracelets. Brainless, it read. Charlie reached out and put this bracelet on my wrist. It was cold as ice, but I couldn't look away. There was something in his eyes that made me remember all those years spent at school with my friend. Then he disappeared. Everything went quiet. I looked at my wrist. The bracelet was real. I realized that my story here was not over yet. Since then, I often come to the abandoned school, listening to children's voices in the wind. I always wear this bracelet to remember. And although it hurts to remember, I know I cannot forget.
Staircase.
This story not only stirred up the entire school, but also an entire city in South America. We're heading to an old school with an external staircase leading from the 2nd floor. The staircase was low and safe, intended for evacuation through a back door in the auditorium. Everything seemed perfectly ordinary until one day a terrible incident occurred. During recess, 2 boys decided to see who could climb up faster. They were having fun, but unfortunately, one of them was not so lucky. He slipped and fell onto the bare asphalt below. It was a horrifying accident, considering the low height of the staircase. The boy died, and the school was enveloped in sorrow. But know that the story is just beginning. Sometime after this tragedy, the surviving boy again decided to climb that cursed staircase. You might think, what recklessness after such an incident? But he could not resist the temptation and risked a quick climb, only to fall and seriously injure his head and spine, eventually succumbing to his injuries. Everyone was horrified, and the school's teachers began to notice that the children who decided to try climbing that very cursed staircase suddenly fell and sustained serious injuries. This was something incredible. All this was happening right before their eyes. However, among all these mystic incidents, one girl managed to climb without numerous injuries or damage, and she told an astonishing thing. When she was climbing the stairs, something was holding and pulling her down. Looking back, she saw a boy. He was strangely dressed. His clothes were covered with some spots that looked like blood. And then the boy said, "Play with me." Startled by what she saw and heard, the girl bolted upward. The teachers were horrified by this story. They forbade the children to climb the stairs and told everyone about this ominous ghost boy. The school's director instantly decided to remove the staircase entirely. It seemed they wanted to rid themselves of all the dreadful events associated with it. Many students and teachers were left with a feeling of trembling fear and anxiety. They could not study and work at the school after the girl's story. Everyone was asking the same question: how could this happen? Why did innocent games on the stairs turn into terrible tragedies? Perhaps it was just a chain of unfortunate incidents. But what if something more sinister was behind all this? The answer to these questions was never found. But after the staircase was removed, the tragic events ceased. Mythical portrait. I've never liked this portrait. Even as a child attending history lessons, it seemed to me that the eyes of the ancient mythical god were following me wherever I moved. I believe it was Ares, with his piercing and insightful gaze. But the point here wasn't about who it was about what happened with the portrait. Every time a student from our school got into trouble, or God forbid died, the portrait would suddenly fall from the nail it hung on. This happened 5 times in the last 20 years. 5 times when the portrait silently fell to the floor, foreshadowing disaster. We all knew about this, and honestly, it frightened us. But most of us tried to treat it as a coincidence, or some kind of unclear school custom. After all, how could a portrait predict death? But everything changed last summer. I was sitting in literature class, contemplating my future and how I wanted to become a doctor, when I suddenly heard a dull sound. The portrait fell. Absolute silence filled the class. Everyone knew what this meant. But who? Which one of the 33 students in the class would be next? We were all shocked. We just didn't know what to do next.
Over the following few days, the school was tense. Everyone was looking at each other, trying not to think about the fallen portrait and what it meant. But we couldn't just forget about it. And then it happened. A teenager named Asher got hit by a car while crossing the road. It was a devastating blow to all of us. The portrait was right, but the worst was yet to come. That day, when we came to history class, the portrait was back in place. And it didn't fall again. No one believed it could happen again. But it did. Exactly at the moment we learned of the history teacher's death from a heart attack, the portrait fell again. Silence. And we all knew that the portrait hadn't fallen in vain. Thank you for listening to all the stories to the end. Subscribe to the channel. Give your likes and comments. Thank you all. See you all later in the story.